Hello and a very warm welcome to this special edition of Corporate Access Africa. I'm Esther Ugbodaga. The rapid growth of Africa's telecommunications market, especially from a mobile perspective, has had a significant and positive impact on the continent, with consumers, businesses and governments alike reaping the benefits of an increasingly connected Africa. But with limited infrastructure, high investment costs and an uneven regulatory environment, the local telecommunications sector is yet to reach its full potential. So how do we address these challenges, and which companies are making strides in the market despite these impediments? That's a big question on today's agenda. And joining me in the studio to share their insights are Issam Darwish. He's the Executive Vice Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the IHS Group. The next guest on our panel is Abiodum Adeoye, Managing Director, Contact Solutions Limited. And on the far side, we have Robert Grant, the Senior Vice President and Head of Project and Structured Finance at FCMB Capital Markets. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for taking the time out to join us. It's a pleasure having you here.
Thank you.
Now, we're all witnesses to what telecommunications has done for Africa, but I think it would be good for us to start by taking stock. Now, Issam, let me start with you. What have you found most intriguing about this great story?
Well, I think if you remember how it all started, the late 90s, Africa barely had any functioning telephone lines. I remember in Nigeria, for example, the total number of working telephones was 300,000 telephones, 300,000 telephone lines. The general manager of Nitel then was like a king. You needed him so badly for your phone line or to fix it, otherwise it just gets stuck without a ringtone for like 6 months. Things have changed so massively from then. Today, Africa has around 750 million working telephone lines, mostly cell phones. Nigeria, of course, penetration ratios is around 70%, which means 70% of every Nigerian, if you don't count double SIM card and things like that, have a telephone line. That's a powerful statistic. We're still not even there yet, because the broadband revolution is also beginning to happen. Barely 10% of every African have a working broadband connection. I think this is going to reshape the future again. Okay,
we'll come to the challenges as we go on in the conversations. Now, Abiodum, for you, to what extent do you think this phenomenal growth we've seen, to what extent do you think it has changed the perception of Africa? Remember, sometimes we used to be known as a dark continent?
Yeah. Well, I think it's essentially opened up Africa to the rest of the world. It's breached, call it the connectivity divide. And it's economically, it's created an environment where service delivery, job creation, and those economic vitals that starts to put Africa on the map. So it's really enabled Africa, for want of a better word. And I think that's, for me, that is the most significant impact, just connecting Africa to the rest of the world and allowing fast, quick information exchange and service delivery across, literally across the globe.
Now, you brought up economic benefits. We'll come to that. Yeah. Robert, what stands out for you when you think back 10, 40, for Nigeria, this year will mark the 14th year since we saw that telecoms explosion. But when you think back, what is that one thing that comes to your mind that you say, oh, wow, this is what this has done for Africa?
I think, to pick up on the points that were made before, it's really brought a lot of attention to Africa. It was considered to be the last horizon for telecom growth. And I think, as Issam has said, over the last 12 years, a lot has happened. And in Africa, I think, with respect to investors coming to Africa, realizing Africa has potential, I think where we see the advantages are the fact that Africa now has the biggest upside in terms of telecom growth globally. And international investors, international operators are all looking at Africa as the last horizon for growth. So I think that's the real benefit. And it's also now allowed other investors to think about other industries within Africa, because no one thought telecom would work. But now that it's worked, they're now looking to do investment across a lot of infrastructure projects.
Now, when you say nobody thought it would work, because a year before it all started, before we saw that explosion, because I'm trying to remember who took the first step or who knew that, putting that seed would just caused that huge explosion? Was it a case of, you know what, we don't know what this landscape is going to be like, we don't know what the response would be, but let's just take our chances? Was that the case?
I think it was driven by the liberalization of telecom globally. And people looked at Africa and looked at the population growth and said, we have to give it a try to make sure we can at least make sure we're have first mover advantage here. So I think people thought it would work, but no one expected the growth that happened. If you recall, in Nigeria, when MTN came in, all the MTN stores were just overrun with people because people wanted connectivity, but they just didn't have the ability to get a line at a price that made sense. I think that it's really opened up everyone's eyes to understand that there is growth in Africa across all sectors. Telecom was the first shot across the bow, but now you see others coming in different spaces.
Issam, I see you nodding. You wanted to add something to that?
Yes, definitely. I wanted to add that I remember when the tender process happened in Nigeria in 2001, I was here. Most groups, even including MTN, did not estimate the kind of potential that existed. People thought maybe 5, 10 million, 15 million, this is going to be more of a niche play. The likes of Orascom, for example, and their advisors withdrew from the process. They thought $280 million for a license was a ridiculously high amount. By today's numbers, it's nothing. It's nothing. I'm sure these guys, if they had understood the potential, they would have paid billions.
Because nobody knew how Africans would react.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I think people measured the potential of the market at the time based on, what they see, lack of infrastructure, significantly high level of poverty, so it was hard to conceive that, we could see the sort of successes that we've seen in the telecom market in Africa. I mean, there was just a huge hunger, and like Robert said, people yearned for the service, but the service wasn't available.
Despite the high poverty level, despite the low, although over the years we've seen income grow.
Yeah, but what's really happened is that when the bold investors like MTN and Econet at the time took the step, they realized a new phenomenon. So despite the poverty, people were happy to substitute, their consumer products that they purchase to make a telephone call, and basically it was just substitution, and you just moved money from one industry to the telecom industry, and they just moved.
I know. I mean, that's why I said we're all witnesses. I mean, we literally woke up one morning and there was this huge explosion. Now let's talk about success stories, Issam, for you. Success stories that stand out for you right from then on up until now.
Well, I think so many of them. Of course, the MNOs by themselves are the major success story on the continent. I think when Africa can create, nurture, and produce to the world a company like an MTN, for example, or so many other MNOs with this kind of size, this kind of market capitalization, this kind of success, and transform the skill set of the various people through training, through discovery, through innovation, I think for me that is major. And of course, down the food chain, you have so many of these that have been created basically that also help transform the level of expertise of people, the skill set, as I said. This for me is the most phenomenal.
Now, Abiodum, for you, what success stories stand out?
Well, I think I'll take that in I guess in two fronts. For me, first of all, the economic benefits of telecommunications.
No, among the companies themselves, the players in the industry.
Well, I mean, the success story is the impact they've been able to make on the environment. So the economic impact that the investment has been able to drive. So the pressure on getting good results has essentially driven infrastructural growth and development to a large extent. Job creation in the economy. Service delivery improvements in the economy. So I think that of course they're reaping the benefits of taking the plunge, But I think the economic impact they also leave behind is quite significant.
Okay.
You know, for Nigeria, certainly for most of the parts of Africa.
Grant, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think that, let me make it slightly more macro than I'll bring it to micro.
Okay.
As we all well know, Nigeria's GDP was rebased recently, and Nigeria's GDP is now larger than South Africa's GDP on paper. And I think that without telecom, that would not have happened. The investment in telecom has been on the magnitude of $20 to $30 billion in the last 13, 14 years. So I think the telecom evolution has really moved Nigeria forward and really helped to grow the GDP and helped to create a middle class. But for me, it's, you know, I look at the smaller side of things because quite as it's kept, there have been a lot of Naira billionaires created by providing value-added services. A lot of these distributors who distribute the cards across the country, they've done quite well for themselves because that has created a ripple effect across the economy. So I think that for me, it's really just raising the level of excellence, but also raising the level of people's ability to move away from the lower base of the economy to a higher base. And so the middle class growth we've experienced is partly due to, you know, the ripple effect of telecom and the value chain that it's brought into the country. And equally so, the telecom growth has also incentivized submarine fiber cable operators to come to Nigeria because prior to 2001, there was one, SAT-3. But now we have, I think, 5 or 6. Because as the telecom sector has grown, as people have now moved away from voice, data is the real attraction. And so you need a lot of fiber capacity. So the investment in fiber in Nigeria has been phenomenal in the last 5 years.
Yeah, you mentioned data, voice. We're going to come to that's been a sticking point. We're looking at the shift from voice to data, but we'll come to that. Now, let me come back to you, Issam. Now, obviously, this is a sector that still has a lot of potential. A lot has been tapped, but obviously, because we know it's dynamic, it's changing, there's still a lot, you know, to be tapped there. So in what areas do you continue to see potential for growth, particularly for 2014?
Look,
and in West Africa.
Yes, of course. As I said earlier, I think the next phase of growth is going to be in broadband, right? The way we use our phone has completely changed. People still talk, but most people don't want to talk anymore. They just want to connect via social networking websites. They want to transact via their phone. I've seen people on dates really doing nothing but basically just texting and handing their phone. So it's changing, right? In 2007, by ITU numbers, I think there were like 250 million broadband connections worldwide. Today there are 2.1 billion. I say 2007 because that's when iPhone was created. So you can begin to see the transformational effect of that smartphone on the telecom landscape. 10% of Africans, so that's like 100 million. So 100 out of the 2.1 billion people on Earth, only 100 million come from Africa. So this number has to change substantially. 50–60% of the population need to have this broadband phone. Smartphones also have become so cheap. So the Chinese, for example, produce phones that sell in Nigeria today for $60 or $70. So that barrier is largely being reduced. So the opportunity, in my opinion, over the next 2–3 years lies largely in the creation and then the utilization, the proper commercialization of broadband in Africa and in Nigeria in particular.
Abiodum, Issam has mentioned broadband, and you know, like I said, this is something we all experience. We've gone from just having a phone where we just make and receive calls and text messages. Now, there's this hunger for speed, connectivity, local content, and it's no longer about just voice, like Issam has brought out at that point. It's now about data. And we've seen from some of the research I did, revenues of some of these companies dropping on the voice side and going over to data. How are these companies responding to this?
Well, I think that you know, Issam is quite right. We're starting to see a significant amount of growth in data utilization. I think what's going to happen is that it's going to force a lot of these companies or other investors to invest in providing more capacity. So, like Robert said. In the last 5 years, we've seen a significant investment in submarine cables, enabling the international connectivity. But that broadband capacity needs to come inland, and there's going to need to be. I guess it's going to force a lot more investment in, fiber capacity inland last mile solutions to deliver broadband capacity to the end user across all industries. I think that what's also will start to happen is where you have infrastructural deficiencies, attention will focus on trying to resolve those issues. So our next big challenge is power, and I guess with the recent restructuring in the power sector, you will start to see in the next 5 years improvement in that infrastructural deficiency.
Okay, well, we will come to, sorry to put in, we will come to the challenges, obviously infrastructure are one of them. Now, Robert, like I mentioned earlier, there's this growing hunger, demand for connectivity, speed, broadband. Can we move faster with where we are right now? Because I know there is a 5-year broadband plan by the federal government, and
Sure.
I've heard critics say, look, this is going to take time. Consumers want speed and they want speed now. So how can the local players, traditional ones, new players coming on board, how can they meet this demand?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that it's a cooperation between the public and the private sector. Obviously, clearly the regulator has to provide a robust sort of environment where people can come in and make investments. But I think that the real issue is going to be the ability, as Abiodum has said, is to provide end-to-end solutions within the sector, because operators can come in. We can invite 4 or 5 more operators into the market if that's what we want to do. Not that we should, but there's a natural bottleneck. So said differently, we've created a huge pipe of fiber, and there's a bit of a bottleneck now to get the fiber connectivity throughout all 36 states. So I think that what has to be done is to really focus on how to ensure that there is connectivity across the country, be it fiber, be it microwave, but I think the real challenge is to make sure that we can optimize that, because the fiber investment has been tremendous. And as it stands now, most of the fiber is in the big cities, not in the remote areas. And the remote areas is where most people live. And that's where I think the value is going to be created in the long run. So I think it's really the government working along with the private sector to make sure that we get this fiber connectivity to everyone in Nigeria, because that's really, if there are 170 million people and there's a 75% penetration, I think that even though it's 75% penetrated, most people are not optimizing their broadband connectivity, because you can't use a lot of those applications that you have on your smartphone.
Now, Issam, that is your field, that is your forte.
Yes.
Tell us, can we move fast? Is this achievable? Because if we're moving with the times, we're moving, obviously we're still, Africa in many ways, we're still playing catch up, in terms of how advanced it is, in the developed economies. But we have policies here, and some people are still dissatisfied in terms of how these policies support the local players. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think people need to be pragmatic in their expectation. We got to 70% or 75% penetration on basic voice technology over 13 years. Today we have in Nigeria, for example, we have roughly around 25,000 towers. A tower is the basic unit of a network. You need tens of thousands of these to be able to properly service your market base. So Nigeria has 25,000 of these. The Presidential Committee on Broadband suggested another 40,000 to achieve the guidelines required. So it took us 13 years to build 25. It's not going to take us.
Do you think everybody has forgotten that it takes 13 years? Because sometimes it feels like yesterday. So do you think that's a feeling?
People want their service and want it now. For example, over the past 3 years, I've seen massive quality issues with the operators. It's not that because their technology is bad or because they're not trying. It's because the demand outstrips supply by large proportions. And as operators do build thousands of these towers, it's still not enough. That's the problem. And just to put things in perspective for you, a simple tower is not just a simple tower. You have to go to the landlord. You have to negotiate with them. You have to find who they are really, and if
the
there
local
are
community
issues,
also.
then you have to build it, and then because power is an issue in Nigeria, so almost every site you have to set up your own small power plant with 2 diesel generators and
perhaps a security guard to protect it.
And then you have to have a logistical network behind that to make sure that good diesel reaches your site without being compromised, without being stolen. This is what a site is, 25,000 of these, and then we need another 40,000. I mean, so it is happening. People like us, this is what we do now. This is why people like us do exist, by the way. This is why the tower industry has come out to existence 3 years ago, and now it's becoming a large player in the telecom industry, because the MNOs, the market, they need now somebody to basically say, okay, fine, look, this has become massive. It's so complicated. We need engineers, with people who can focus on this thing and make it work, and that's what we do.
Abiodum, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Issam has just painted a very vivid picture of the complexity.
That is our reality.
Yeah, that's our reality.
Exactly.
It's you know, the complexity of trying to grow, you know, rapidly. I mean, it's not as simple. Now, I agree with you that data is growing at a much faster rate than voice did. I mean, voice has been around for a long time and will continue to be around for a very long time. But what we're finding is that data technologies have evolved so much rapidly, and you know, there continues to be more demand for more capacity, and we will have to apply some out of the box thinking in order to be able to deliver to that demand.
Can we have, because you know, when I hear out of the box thinking, you know, can we have those out of the box, those solutions? Those
okay, so yeah, so there are solutions. So there are solutions that can. So you know, in addition to sort of building the broad coverage towers, which carries the large capacity sites, there's a lot of pico technology, micro technology that can soak up a lot more data, because of the demand for network resources, the higher demand for network resources on data, you're going to have to almost build your network, a multi-hierarchy network, so that, for example, when people go into a building, the data demand can be pushed to a lower layer of the network as opposed to the upper layer of the network, freeing up the upper layer of the network for voice and other services. So we're going to have to apply those sort of smart technology to enable us move rapidly within the constraints, the infrastructural constraints that we have, trying to utilize existing infrastructure, you know, and existing coverage.
So basically just realizing that, look, this is our situation, this is our reality. Yes, you know, the US has better statistics in terms of how they're growing, but we can't catch up with Malaysia or the US. You know, we need to
not on the wider scale.
I think, you know, to the point about out of the box thinking, the out of the box thinking has already started. There was a company in the US called OB3 that wanted to launch satellites to provide broadband coverage. Because a lot of people now realize that, you know, to provide coverage to everyone is going to be expensive. So how do we provide it without having to go through a terranean solution? I remember hearing that Google a few years ago was looking at launching some sort of special balloons that provide coverage. You know, and that benefits them obviously, because the balloons will be Google branded, and obviously, you know, people will Google. So I think the out-of-the-box solutions have been proposed, but it's the practicality of those. I think to Issam's point, Nigeria does need another, if we think it needs another 40,000, it's probably another 80,000. Because as you build, there'll be more people who are getting online. The youth now who grew up on telephony expect to have a smartphone by the time they're 13 or 14. So I think that, as the only banker on the panel, I should say that the challenge is going to be capital. It's going to be capital. Financing. I mean,
but this company, they need to expand their footprints. Issam, do you
yes.
He's mentioned 80,000. That's
a number I threw out, but whatever we think it is, it's going to be more.
But there's money involved.
To be 80,000. I think two things here. Out of the box, I think, again, this is Africa where it's back to basics. So we need to also be mindful of the steps, the start of the steps we make. So balloons is a great idea. Is it gonna work? I don't know. Amazon, for example, is now experimenting with drones delivering goods to your home step. Is it gonna work? At this point,
do you think we should rule out anything? Because nobody expects us to be here. So perhaps let's not rule out, you know, this.
No. I think it's too early for a drone in Lagos to tell you the truth.
Okay.
But what it's not early for, and that's why, again, we've been working so well, is basics but outside the box. So for example, MTN, Airtel, Etisalat, each of these guys, they built their own towers, they built their own networks over the past 13 years. Going forward, they don't have to. So one network, one tower, and then they share. This means basically rather than them spending $1 billion each on capex, for example, we get to spend that $1 billion. Rather than each of them spending hundreds of millions of dollars on OPEX, the bill is
that's you, the infrastructure, the
we do the infrastructure.
Okay.
That's the core of our business, basically. Okay. So we now are building these towers on their behalf. We own it, and we just lease it to them. So we take it off their balance sheet. And we're asking them, and we're saying, look, guys, you have this billions of dollars of towers and steel sitting on your balance sheet doing nothing, basically. Sell it to us. So we buy their towers, we refurbish, and then we allow others to use it, effectively sharing the infrastructure among the different operators. So in terms of basically taking broadband to the next level in a quicker and a more efficient way, network sharing, in my opinion, is something that can work, and it's working as we speak.
I agree.
Okay, gentlemen.
The capital has been an issue for sure, right? But we're seeing that it is more and more becoming a non-issue in Africa. I mean, I hope this doesn't change with what the US is doing now, the Fed Reserve printing less money and things like that. But again, last year we raised around $1 billion for the deployment of our projects in Nigeria, in Africa. This year probably we're going to raise slightly more or even more. I mean, things are definitely changing for the continent. Okay,
well, hold your thoughts, gentlemen. We're going to come out, take a short break at this point. We're going to come back to talk more, continue with what we're looking at, the telecom space and how it's impacting on the African space. We'll be right back. Still with me in the studio to unpack the impact of telecommunications investment and development on the African continent is Issam Darwish. He's the Executive Vice Chairman and CEO of the IHS Group. Also, Abiodum Adeoye, Managing Director, Contact Solutions Limited, and Robert Grant, the Senior Vice President and Head of Project and Structured Finance at FCMB Capital Markets. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for sticking around.
Thank you.
Now, we've talked quite a bit looking at where we were, how the telecoms phenomenon as it were started. Now, let's go into challenges. We've talked a bit about that in the course of our conversation, but let's go into the nitty-gritty of challenges now. What I hear analysts talk about all the time from the players themselves also is infrastructure constraints, high investment costs, and uneven or difficulty in a regulatory environment. Let's talk about the infrastructure. Issam, that is your forte. For you, what is the biggest infrastructure challenge for the industry, both new players, old players, traditional players, especially for 2014?
I think the size of the network is the biggest problem, in my opinion. As I said earlier, we have to move from a scale of 25,000 towers in Nigeria, for example, to a scale of 50, 70, even more.
Is that achievable? If you say that this is what we can do, this is a problem, this is what we can do, is it achievable?
It has to happen. Otherwise, there won't be a broadband revolution. If it doesn't happen, we're not going to be able to provide Africans with good working smartphones. It's just not going to happen. So it's just a matter of us figuring out how do we do it. Capital needs to be involved. Engineers like us need to be involved. The operators need to be involved. The vendors who bringing the equipment, the new generation equipment need to be involved. Every single layer, the regulators, the tax authorities, every layer need to enable it, basically. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. But yes, it needs to happen.
Abiodum, your thoughts on that? How do we make this happen? How do we get around the infrastructure challenges? He's mentioned, everybody on the value chain needs to, of course, come together. There needs to be concerted efforts. But for you, practically speaking, how can we get around that?
Well, I think Robert mentioned earlier that it's got to be a combined effort between the public and the private sector. So the regulator needs to play their role to enable more, to create an environment where more investment can come in to try and develop infrastructure.
What is that one thing that you think the regulators can do to make that happen?
Well, I think that the regulator themselves have an obligation to develop policies that creates the environment, or that creates the enabler for for investors to be encouraged to put more investment in develop infrastructure growth. So, for example, the Ministry of Communication and Technology is about to release the broadband policy, I think that would help to see a lot more investment in broadband, both from government effort and for private sector effort. And similar policies need to come out from the power sector and other areas of infrastructural challenge, so that the government can help the private sector tackle this issue. To try and alleviate the infrastructural challenges preventing the rapid growth of the sector.
I'd love to say it's going to happen overnight, but this is a long marathon, and we're only about halfway.
Did you say it will happen overnight?
It cannot happen overnight.
Cannot happen overnight.
I wish it could. And unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of pain in the short term, and we have to manage our expectations. If they worked every day for the next 5 years, they'd only be able to build another 10 or 15,000 towers. It's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time. So I think that expectations across all sectors, public sector, private sector, must be managed to recognize that to get from where we are, which is 25,000 towers to 50,000 towers, is probably a 5 to maybe 10-year exercise.
Even if there's adequate financing?
Yeah.
Because it takes
Issam,
time.
if you have enough money?
I think we can.
Can't you
that's
build
why
more?
the out-of-the-box solutions come in place. Yeah. If we are to do this 5 years ago, I probably agree with him. It would have just taken time, brute force, just build a tower after a tower. But now with the sharing concept, with the leasing, with what we do basically, having 3 or 4 guys on the same tower. I mean, look at Lagos. Lagos, if you look at the skyline of Lagos, it's filled with towers, right? Towers that are owned by different people. So if somebody can consolidate basically, then immediately you give the likes of an MTN, for example, access onto thousands of new towers, the likes of Airtel, thousands of new towers, whom they weren't built for them. You know what I mean? So this could bridge the gap. Right. So I won't say maybe 5 to 10. I think it needs to happen within the next 2 to 3 years.
So who can start that? Who can be in the who can lead that? Because Issam talked about consolidation. He said if MTN could do that, but don't the networks talk? Don't we have a forum or some kind of platform where we can?
They weren't talking before. They've started to talk.
Yeah.
I think what's happened is that 5 years ago the profitability of the networks was such that they could afford to own all the towers, but as the penetration has grown and the profitability per subscriber, which is what we call ARPUs, come down, they've now realized that increasingly their revenue is going to be squeezed and the margin is going to be squeezed, but yet the OPEX is going up. So they now need to realize that they need to get rid of the OPEX, CAPEX, or turn what is formerly CAPEX into OPEX, that way you can predict your monthly spend and then focus on marketing to those customers, because essentially telecom has become commoditized. So how do I make a difference to the average subscriber between the 3 networks? It's a marketing sort of strategy. So I think part of it is just recognizing that as the penetration continues to increase, the margins come down, and that's why data now is going to help to boost those margins going forward. So I think that it's a natural evolution of business, and we've gone from a growth stage to a slightly maturity stage. We're not on the downside yet, but we're now almost at the top of the curve, and people have to now realize that if they don't change the business model, they will not survive into the future. I think that's really what IHS brings to the table, and that has to happen because it's happened elsewhere. If you travel around the world, almost no operator owns his sites. They own some, but by and large, there are large operators around the world who do nothing other than what is happening here now, which is to own the hard assets and allow people to rent from those assets, and that has to happen.
Okay, now I know we've talked about changing consumer behavior. We've talked about voice and a shift from voice to data. Now for 2014 in West Africa, do you see the players, especially the key players, do you see them putting more money on the table? Because if they're looking at falling revenues on the voice side, definitely they have to up their game and put more money on data side. For 2014, how do you see this panning out?
For sure. So we spoke about the network, which is the enabling environment, creating the actual link. Yeah, I think that is. But then again, on the other hand of things, is content, the applications basically that enable this to happen. So I see, and I speak to them all the time. Operators are actively pursuing, studying, analyzing, looking in the market, talking mostly to young guys, young people who come up with all these ideas, try to create a Nigerian Amazon, a Nigerian Badu, a Nigerian whatever.
So they're turning this challenge into an opportunity.
Yes.
They're trying to take advantage.
And I'll give you a concrete example. For example, is I do not foresee a situation where Africans or credit cards would work in here. I just don't. I don't know why. I don't see credit cards working in Nigeria. I don't see credit cards working in so many African environments. It's difficult to get the references and then the required set of whatever. I don't see it happening. Mobile phones, for example, could be the alternative, as we've seen in Kenya. Kenya, for example, your mobile phone is your purse. You can pay, you can receive, you can withdraw cash. This I would see happening on an explosive scale in Nigeria.
So connectivity
maybe
is going to be
2014,
one of the
maybe
key
2015. You have to have the broadband link, and then the operators need to enable these applications. And then you'll see entrepreneurs coming from left and right, your non-traditional entrepreneurs, coming with all sorts of applications that basically work.
And these networks have to keep up. Now, let's
so
digress. Okay, you want to add something?
Well,
Go ahead.
I think the biggest challenge for the operators is actually delivering the capacity to be able to cope with the growth in the e-commerce sector that, like he said, whether it be e-banking or or e-sales. So we've seen a lot of companies, like Jumia and Konga, etc., doing it, coming up and growing quite rapidly. Those kind of companies put more demand on broadband and data.
Sure.
And what you find, the trend is actually that a lot more of their subscribers actually interact with these e-commerce sites through their mobile devices. There's far more data engagement through mobile devices than laptops or
Sure.
computer devices that have sort of fixed data devices. So that's putting a lot of pressure on the operators to find solutions to deliver the throughput required for their mobile interfaces to engage with this kind of sites. He also mentioned apps. There's a lot of apps development. Google is here supporting local entrepreneurship for apps development. Yeah, exactly. So there's a growing demand of engagement on the mobile interface that is putting pressure on the mobile MNOs, for the operators, to deliver throughput to enable that. And this same data engagements is contending with the traditional voice, which is still there, sort of highest revenue, even though Apple is declining, like it says. So in order for them to be able to ensure that they are able to meet this obligation, like Robert says, their focus has shifted from trying to build more network and to trying to drive their core business, which is service delivery. So you find that the natural progression will occur for them to stop building towers and get the likes of IHSs to
outsource it. Take
essentially outsource
off
it. In fact, they've gone as far as outsourcing the network management. So, dealing with delivery of diesel and going to site to fix spares, etc.
So they can focus on their bottom
delivering
line.
the services, exactly, which is the problem.
Yeah, I think I'd like to make 2 points on that. The applications. I think over the last 5 years, we've seen change in the sort of back office type of approach. For example, Google is now hosting in Nigeria, whereas before they were hosting offshore. They actually host in Nigeria. So that's why when you sometimes try to Google, you see the local languages, the local flavor come into that. With the Google coming here, that will now force evolution of new apps, a new approach, a new view on how this service can be deployed throughout the country, and to provide value-added applications for consumers. The other point is that consumer is now a bit confused about why the phone doesn't work. When your phone doesn't work, you don't know if it's the network, you don't know if it's the diesel that's not working at the site, you don't know if it's the submarine fiber cable. And the consumer shouldn't have to worry about those things. The consumer should be able to pick up their phone and make a call without worrying about, is it my operator? So I think what we're trying to do collectively between financiers and infrastructure operators is to make sure that consumer doesn't have to think about where the bottleneck is. So I think it's really going to be a huge effort on the part of all stakeholders to make sure that everything goes according to plan, because we can build the best sites with the best locations. If there's no diesel in those generators, you can't make a call. So I think really it's going to be collective effort.
But are you confident that we can, they can all keep it together?
I think that discussion is now becoming more topical, because people now starting to realize that we can't do it individually. Everyone has to sit down and cooperate, be it the NCC, be it the operators, be it the equipment manufacturers. Everyone has to now come to the table and consciously work together, because we cannot work in silos. It has to be on that level of discussion that people understand that everyone has to do their part. So
Okay.
I think I see that in going forward, that increasingly will become the narrative around which we can now evolve this entire sort of ecosystem of telecom growth.
Okay. Okay. You want to say something?
Yeah,
Abiodun?
and just to add to that, I think what's going to become more prevalent is quality of service delivery, and as Robert alluded to, the consumer is getting wiser. They are starting to understand, and demand for good quality service. So what you find is that the quality of service demand is going to get the operators, the regulators, and all the other stakeholders to sit together to say, how do we deliver better quality service to the end user? At Concert Solutions, we run a call center, a PPO call center, and we see the challenges that consumers face with quality of service challenges from that end, because that is where they call in to vent their anger and express their displeasure in the inability to make a call. You want to pick up your phone, you want to make a call, and you want to be able to hold a call, a conversation for at least 3 to 5 minutes before, it shouldn't
It's
drop
that long.
anyways.
It's that long.
But you don't even, you can't even do that. And what we're finding is that on the network side, there's a lot of contention for resource availability on the network, which is not helped by the infrastructural challenges. So when you're making that call and you drop a call, you don't know whether the next site is not working because there's no diesel there, or whether they've not optimized it properly, so you couldn't get a channel from going to voice, or data. So there's a lot of challenges that it all needs to converge, and and all the stakeholders need to sit together to figure out how to resolve this challenge.
Okay, right, Abiodun. Now, Issam, let me come to you. Now that we've talked about these companies, the telecoms companies, outsourcing, taking some of that load off their balance sheets, giving it to companies like IHS, to worry for them. Let's talk about investment into next generation networks away from the challenges, particularly spectrum. I know that is something that the Nigerian Communications Commission wants to auction out. I remember I did bring up a point earlier on that the House of Reps yesterday at a session, they did say that these licenses, if they're given out by the NCC, they will go into what they call private hands, because we know that most of these mobile operators, they're foreign companies, and they say that it will not be in the best interest of the country. And we know what this could do in terms of expanding the landscape, the ecosystem. So if that problem is thrown in the way for you, how do we get around it, Issam?
Yeah, I think the frequency is probably the biggest area where the regulator really needs to step up and do something. It's not only about the frequency that they're about to auction, or the kind of tough regulation they want to impose. I think also, if you remember, again, when the telecom when it started in Nigeria in particular, for example, we had two paths. We had the GSM path and then the CDMA path. So government gave frequencies to both. Unfortunately, CDMA operators could not make it through. So the likes of Multilinks, the likes of Starcoms, the likes of Intercellular, they're having issues. But still what that means is that very valuable spectrum, 800, 900 megahertz spectrum, extremely valuable for broadband growth, is still in these guys' hands. So the NCC needs to find a solution for that. Yes, of course, the auctioning process, the 2.3 gigahertz need to happen fast. Any other spectrum that is out there needs to get into the private hand. I really see where government also is coming from.
But a good thing you mentioned, that is that a legitimate concern?
It is a big concern, because if
no, not that fact that there might be a delay in giving out the licenses for the spectrum. The reasons the lawmakers themselves have given, the fact that if given this, it will be in private hands. Do you think that holds water?
I don't think that holds water, to tell you the truth. I think we've seen these guys do great work over the past 12, 13 years.
So it shouldn't be about who holds it. It should be Abiodum.
No, yeah. I mean, like we said earlier, it's political.
But it's an issue because we know what spectrum. Issam just told us what spectrum can do for the space.
I think the important thing is to put the licenses in the hands of those that can make the investment, and create the regulatory environment to ensure that that investment is made. It's not about whether it's in the hands of a local or private, or it's the right people or group of people that can make the investment to ensure that we achieve the growth set out in the broadband policy and whatever other policy that moves the industry forward.
Yeah. Grant, if we did have the spectrum, how is that going to change the space? What would spectrum do?
Spectrum allows better data.
Yeah.
Simply put, because all the operators now who are trying to launch data services are spectrum constrained, because you don't have enough spectrum on a contiguous basis. You can't launch good quality data services. So spectrum is very important, and it's also a rare commodity. And once you have sold the spectrum, there is no more. So I think that spectrum is very important. But back to the point about foreign ownership versus local ownership, I think it shouldn't really matter. I think whoever is going to buy the licenses needs to have enough capital to deploy those licenses, because what happened a few years ago, a lot of people bought, when they auctioned the licenses in 2000, 2001, a lot of people rushed to buy licenses because they thought, how difficult can it be to launch a network? And as we see now in 2014, only those who were properly capitalized have survived. So let's not repeat the mistakes of the past by trying to, I won't say politicize, but trying to limit the ownership of those licenses. I think in terms of new generation networks, the next evolution is 4G. But I think that let's get the 3G right first. Let's maximize the 3G before we go to 4G, because 4G investments require another round of huge investments. Said differently, it's unlikely that those who have a 3G network can use those networks for 4G. You have to get the spectrum, you have to get the handsets, you have to get all the equipment that goes with that. And as it stands now, there hasn't been, the full efficiencies of 3G have not been realized. So to go from 3G to 4G, and some people are talking about 5G already, I think is a bit too fast, too soon. So I think let's just focus on, yes, we need spectrum. Let's focus on maximizing the 3G footprint before we now start talking about 4G, because the question about 4G is very simply put, can the consumers afford that now? Because the cost has to be recovered. So if you launch a 4G network, you have to raise your tariffs, you have to invest huge capex. Can consumers afford that now? And I think that's really the bigger issue around 4G. It will come, but I'm not sure it needs to come immediately, because there is a lot of work that has to go into network planning, new sites, new equipment. It's really quite a very expensive task, and most countries are not 4G, not quite at the 4G level yet. Some are, but most countries are not.
For West Africa,
compliant.
We're not.
No.
Okay, now I know the basis for this conversation is how we can achieve a truly connected Africa using telecommunications space. I know we've all mentioned different components of how to what it would take. Now let's put it all together. Your vision, Issam, of a truly connected Africa. Step 1, step 2, step 3. In that order, what do we need to do or begin to do, perhaps starting from 2014? And perhaps as a matter of urgency.
I think this year we need to consolidate infrastructure and then also solve the spectrum problem. So NCC seems to be doing the right steps this year. So hopefully towards mid-end of this year, infrastructure would have been more optimal in the hands of people like us, and then of course frequency would have been up. The year after, I think, has to be about massive explosion of capital investments into
Speaking about capital investment, I know IHS, I know you have taken, you've put a lot of money on the table, over $1 billion in debt and equity.
Year,
you want to tell us what, what to expect in 2014, how you're going to be deploying this cash, where your investments will be, where your footprints will be.
This money was raised last year and it's largely deployed. We deployed it in Nigeria by building new sites. We bought also the networks from the likes of MTN and Orange in Cameroon and Ivory Coast. In December, we signed 2 new deals with MTN in Zambia and in Rwanda, where we're buying their towers also and then refurbishing and leasing it to others. This year, we're also raising a substantial large amount of capital. It's the plan right now is for slightly under $1 billion, but I think I talked to operators in Nigeria. I think Nigeria's year is going to be probably this year, so we may even need to raise this amount. It could double. I don't know.
No, before we've talked a lot about Nigeria. How is all of this playing out in the broad West African region? Ghana, Togo, Benin Republic. What strides are we seeing there?
Well, some of these markets, the thing about Africa is every country is a different country. If you don't realize that, you're not going to be able to make any. So Ghana is not in Nigeria, although some tribes may be similar, some people may speak similar, but it's a totally different. Ghana is more advanced when it comes to the penetration levels, for example. Ghana has 5 or 6 operators, each have their own market shares. It began consolidating their infrastructure or the tower sharing thing like 3.5 years ago, so they began slightly ahead. They're making quicker strides onto broadband, Ghana in particular. Other countries like Guinea, for example, they're still way behind. Burkina is more advanced. Ivory Coast is more advanced. Nigeria is again, I think, given the scale, is well advanced in terms of where it is. So each is in a different place, but overall, voice is somewhere between 50 to maybe 80–90% penetration, and broadband is always the issue. It's always low. Penetration 10% or lower.
Robert, you wanted to add to that?
No, I think from a private sector side, we can do what we can do, we have to do in order to move this forward. But I think, as Issam has said, the governments need to help this situation, because from Ghana to Togo to Benin to Nigeria, you don't have that seamless cross-border relationships between the regulators. So I think there needs to be some cooperation amongst the regional governments within ECOWAS to make sure that there's connectivity across all the countries, and that operators and infrastructure providers can move from country to country without having to go through a full range of regulatory and legal and environmental issues. So I think that is where the regulators need to start thinking in terms of helping the entire ECOWAS region to move forward as one homogeneous unit in terms of connectivity, in terms of tariffs, in terms of roaming. Because when you move from one country to the other, the roaming charges can vary widely between countries. So I think that needs to be harmonized. So I think that will come in time.
Abiodum, let's talk about your vision of a connected Africa as we're gradually winding down now. When you picture a vision of connected Africa, what comes to your mind?
Well, connectivity beyond borders. I think, as Robert said, there needs to be, connectivity across African countries. I understand, from Issam's point of view, the dynamics and the challenges are different. The different countries are not moving at the same pace. Nigeria is probably
Is that a problem if we have that uneven growth across the continent?
Well, as long as we can converge it somewhere, and there's a plan to converge. Nigeria obviously has the bigger of all the challenges. I mean, across most African countries, I'm sure you experience.
I guess a bigger market comes with a bigger.
Well, but it also seems to be the most attractive because of the population size. And amongst other things. But I think that you will find that not only the telecom sector, but other sectors are trying to have pan-African operations. In the banking sector, the banks are trying to establish themselves
huge convergence taking place
across other parts of Africa. Dangote is establishing operations across Africa. So
Abiodum,
all these,
I'm going to have to come in some final words. We're wrapping up. Final words. Connectivity on the African continent, especially for 2014. Are we going to see any surprises? Are we going to see, I'm trying to have some breaking news here. Are we going to have any surprises? Is there going to be a landmark, something that's going to happen, perhaps a UC coming?
Look, I think Africa will always surprise. There will be big things happening. I foresee big things happening in Nigeria this year. I think this is the year of the infrastructure, as I said. be it towers, be it frequency. All these things need to happen this year for the big picture to be enabled. And I think the big picture is, in my opinion, every African carrying a smartphone and using it for work, for love, for life, for buying.
For love, I like that. Robert, final words.
No, I fully agree with everything that's been said. This is going to be a big year, and there'll be surprises. There'll definitely be some surprises this year. And I think that's good because it really keeps us sharp and focused on what we need to do, which is to provide the consumer with quality service all the time, everywhere, without having to worry about where the drop is in terms of the value chain. That's what we should do.
Thank you so much. On that note, we're going to have to cut off because that brings us to the end of the conversation. Thank you so much, gentlemen. It's been an absolute pleasure having you talking about telecom space in Africa. That brings us to the end of this special edition of Corporate Access Africa. Thank you to my guest, Issam Darwish. He's the Executive Vice Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the IHS Group. I've also had Abiodum Adeoye, Managing Director, Contact Solutions Limited, and Robert Grant, the Senior Vice President and Head of Project and Structured Finance at FCMB Capital Markets. Until next time, it's goodbye and thank you for joining us.